World News Today, brought to you by Admiral Corporation in behalf of distributors and dealers all over America and in many foreign lands. By shortwave broadcast direct from important overseas stations and leading news centers of our own country, CBS reporters are waiting to bring you first-hand news from the world's political and battlefronts. Now, here's Douglas Edwards.
American tanks and men are swarming across the Brittany Peninsula today, and the cleanup campaign has begun at Brest. Other American columns are turning eastward toward Paris. More than 1,000 of our planes have bombed Berlin and the Hamburg and Kiel areas of Germany. In the east, the Red Army's campaigns against East Prussia and Warsaw are entering the last stage. Berlin says the Russians have made a breakthrough north of the Niemen River. German shells are crashing inside Florence today, but the British Eighth Army has planted itself firmly along the Arno on both sides of the city. In the Pacific, a fast American task force operating off the Bonin and Volcano Islands has wiped out a Jap convoy. And now for news on the Battle of France, Admiral takes you to Normandy. Bill Downs reporting.
Senior British staff officers said tonight that the German 7th Army, assigned to hold the Allied troops within their Normandy beachhead, had suffered a major defeat, and that the events of the past 10 days had given the American, British, and Canadian forces in France their first big victory. This high staff officer said that since D-Day, the Allied troops in France had virtually eliminated 13 German divisions, and no army could stand to lose the number of prisoners alone that the Germans have lost to us without suffering a major defeat. The British staff officer paid special tribute to the American forces now roaming Britain. The Americans have been remarkable in exploiting their gains through very tough country, he said. Then he added, we can learn a lot from them. This high British officer, who is in a position to know the complete picture of the war, painted the most optimistic picture that we have had since we've been here in France. He said that the Germans appeared to be establishing a series of fortress areas around the important Brittany ports, which the American forces are now threatening. The Germans are carrying out demolition in these ports. And in addition to a great land victory, the American tanks in Brittany also have won one of the war's greatest naval victories. The capture of the Brittany ports will wipe out Hitler's main U-boat and E-boat bases and force a complete change of German naval strategy. However, the Germans are expected to fight bitterly for their now cut-off fortress ports. It is impossible to be anything but extremely optimistic at the present stage of the war, the officer said. And then he went on to give his reasons for this optimism. First, on the land front, the Russian advance is threatening Germany itself. In Italy, there are a series of unbroken victories that should continue. The Western Front is going like a house afire, and the resistance front inside occupied France is almost boiling over.
You have heard from Bill Downs in France, and now Admiral takes you to CBS London, Richard C. Hottelet reporting.
Spotlight is shifting to another part of the French battlefront tonight, to the area around Mayenne, Laval, and eastward, into which American forces are still pushing. With the cleaning up of the Brest Peninsula now not much more than a tactical exercise, General Bradley is striking out in this new direction. And it's important for several reasons. For one thing, it's another drive. It's not just a few half-tracks on reconnaissance patrol. After taking the towns of Laval and Mayenne, we're moving on in strength. The Germans tonight say that the force that reached Laval yesterday evening consisted of several tank and infantry divisions. This new movement shows that our command is quick on its feet and can change the direction of its thrust always to go after the major objective. And that we've got the strength to spare for another independent operation. And that's another reason why this move eastward can be very important. For one thing, it's headed straight for Paris. But much more immediately, if it continues, it can very well outflank the entire German Normandy front. Our thrust seems headed in the general direction of Alençon, which would leave the entire German 7th Army on our flank. And remember, this is happening without weakening the Allied forces that are giving the Germans so tough a time in Normandy right now. In Brittany, there have been no new developments as far as we know. Brest hasn't been taken, and it may be that the Germans will put up a stiff fight for it. Our combat teams are roaming the peninsula at will, it seems. Speaking of Allied strength, we all know that the Americans, British, and Canadians have considerable force in France. So far, we've officially heard of only 2 armies. Tonight, the Germans report that we have a total of 4 armies in France. and add the American Third Army and the Canadian First Army to the ones that have already officially been announced. There's no word of air developments over the battlefront in France today, but 1,000 heavy bombers have hit Berlin, Kiel, and Hamburg before noon today. I return you now to Admiral in New York.
More news in just a moment, but first here's Warren Sweeney with a word from Admiral Corporation.
When you can see the post-war Admiral two-temperature refrigerator, probably the first question you'll ask is, what's become of the freezing coils? And the answer will simply be, they're gone. At least they'll be gone as far as the eye can see. And you can readily understand how much more storage room for food there'll be in the Admiral. But it means more than that. No freezing coils means goodbye forever to the messy bother of defrosting. Think of never again having to defrost your refrigerator. Actually, of course, the freezing coils aren't gone. Admiral engineers have simply built them between the walls of the refrigerator. When you examine those walls, you'll notice that they are covered with beads of moisture. Gone will be the drying cold that draws the moisture from the air and from the foods in the refrigerator. With Admiral's purified moist cold, foods will stay fresh and wholesome much longer without the use of covered dishes. Remember that. No need for covered dishes. There'll be many more surprises for you in the Admiral two-temperature refrigerator. Sterilamp with its ultraviolet ray action to kill bacteria and retard mold. A built-in home freezer that will quick freeze or store 2 bushels of frozen foods. These and many more new ideas will make the Admiral post-war refrigerator just as outstanding as Admiral Radio, America's smart set. Now, here once again is Douglas Edwards.
Within the past few hours, the Germans have been telling of a Russian breakthrough north of the Niemen River defense belt guarding the approaches to East Prussia. The enemy says that heavy battles are raging in that area, but he doesn't locate it further. We do know, however, that the Red Army is ripped into the German flanks guarding the East Prussian coast and the vital sector between Warsaw and Lomza, and that huge enemy pockets in the direction of Krakow have been liquidated. But now, to discuss with you the situation on the Eastern Front, here is Columbia's military analyst, Major George Fielding Elliott.
The situation on the long Russian front has been more or less stabilized for the past 8 days, but now appears to be undergoing some change. In the Baltic states, there are signs that the supposedly trapped Northern German Army group under Colonel General Lindemann is now withdrawing on a broad front from the Narva Isthmus and the region of Lake Peipus. This, plus the German claim to have retaken the rail junction of Jelgava south of Riga, may indicate a forthcoming attempt on the part of the Germans to break through the narrow Russian corridor running up to the Gulf of Riga in order to permit Lindemann's 20 to 25 good divisions to withdraw southwestward and join in the defense of East Prussia. If this proves true, it will mark a sharp reversal of the Hitler hold everything strategy. On the East Prussian front, the Russians are advancing slowly against a German resistance which is termed fanatical. The Russians do not yet officially claim any crossing of the German frontier, though they are very close to it. The axis of the Russian advance seems to be directed toward the so-called Insterberg Gap between the River Niemen and the Masurian Lakes. This is the traditional weak spot in the defense of East Prussia. In the Warsaw area, the Russians suffered a sharp check during the past week, their advance elements east and northeast of Warsaw running into heavy German resistance in front of the Narew River line. The Germans claimed that some Russian forces were cut off, but increased Russian pressure northwest of the town of Shadlsy seems to be restoring this situation and may soon again bring the Russian pressure directly against the east bank suburbs of the Polish capital. This is a position of considerable anxiety, for Polish underground resistance in Warsaw itself has flamed high, and we must hope that it is not premature. There has been no considerable Russian crossing of the Vistula River south of Warsaw, as far down as the confluence of the river San at the town of Sandomierz, which is still in German hands. Southwest of Sandomierz, however, the Russians have effected a crossing of the Vistula, which is, at the moment, beginning to threaten the old Polish capital of Krakow. In this region, a powerful German counterattack seems imperative if the Germans are to prevent the expansion of the Russian bridgehead and the eventual outflanking of the Warsaw area from the south. It remains to be seen whether Field Marshal von Model, the commander of the German forces in this area, disposes of sufficient force to deliver such a counterstroke. Still further south, the Russians have made local advances in the Carpathian region, which threaten the Galician oil fields, an important source of German petroleum supply. And now here again is Douglas Edwards.
Berlin radio says that Adolf Hitler has made another speech, this one on Friday, before a gathering of high party officials. The broadcast disclosed that Hitler, in appealing again for full party loyalty to himself, admitted that anti-Nazi generals had been sabotaging his regime ever since he came to power 11 years ago. The Germans are still pouring shells into the historic city of Florence. But now for details of the fighting in Italy, Admiral takes you to Rome. George Morad reporting.
It's a beautiful summer evening in Rome, just before the dinner hour. The Borghese gardens are crowded with Allied troops, flirting with pretty Roman girls. People are promenading by the old Spanish steps. There's good food, music, and fairly good wine at the big hotels. Just outside.
We regret the interruption of our broadcast from Rome. Here are further details of the situation on the Italian front. Bullets are whistling through the ancient streets of Florence today, and the Germans, despite promises to respect the Tuscan Arts Center as an open city, are pouring heavy artillery fire into the southern sections where the British Eighth Army is deployed. The London radio said that Florence is virtually in our hands, with the city something of a no-man's land. The broadcast, as heard by the Columbia shortwave listening station, said that South African troops have thrown pontoon bridges across the Arno River, flowing through the city, to replace those destroyed by the retreating enemy. Allied headquarters says that British artillery has not been turned against the northern district, containing the bulk of Florence art treasures and where strong German forces have taken a stand. On both sides of the Florence, the Eighth Army planted itself firmly along the Arno River, and the position of those German forces still south of the formidable stream is considered untenable. The enemy, raining long-range 6.5-inch shells into the part of Florence which lies south of the Arno, is firing from good mountain positions north of the city. Small arms fire was exchanged inside Florence across the Arno. Most of the shooting came from buildings demolished near Ponte Vecchio, the only one of the city's historic bridges left intact by the retreating Germans. On the Adriatic end of the Italian front, the Germans are drawing back toward Rimini, the eastern coastal anchor of their Gothic line, with Polish troops in pursuit. The Poles have captured the villages of Brunetto, Monte di Ripe, and San Vito, 2 or 3 miles beyond the Misa River and some 40 miles south of Rimini. Bringing up their forces all along the line, the British have sent patrols into Empoli, some 15 miles west of Florence. From Florence westward to the sea, the stage is being set for the Battle of the Arno. On the western end of the river line, American patrols have crossed the stream and probed enemy positions, returning after several hours behind German lines. A German patrol trying to infiltrate American positions was wiped out. The Germans were firing on the southern sections of Pisa on the lower Arno with artillery and mortars. The Arno is a military obstacle of importance from Florence westward. The bed is 250 to 600 feet wide. Within Pisa and Florence, the river flows between masonry banks averaging about 20 feet in height. Eighth Army units strengthening the Allied line between Florence and the Adriatic have seized Bibbiano in the upper Arno River Valley, about 27 miles east of Florence and nearby Monte Grillo. There has been a new naval engagement in the waters off Tokyo. For a first-hand report on this battle and an interview with the correspondent who has just returned from the Marianas fighting, Admiral takes you now to Pearl Harbor. Webley Edwards reporting.
In a communique just released, Admiral Nimitz has announced that air and surface units of a fast carrier task force on the 3rd and 4th of August virtually wiped out a Japanese convoy and raided airfields, towns, and ground installations in the Bonin and Volcano Islands groups. We lost from enemy anti-aircraft fire 16 planes and 19 flight personnel. Just returned from the Marianas is John Bishop, war correspondent for the Saturday Evening Post. He arrived at Saipan on D-Day, covered that operation, went on to Tinian on D-Day, and was there during that swiftly developing operation. John, what's the word?
Well, Tinian has been a bit overshadowed by Guam. But Tinian is an extremely important island. It has the most valuable airfield in the Marianas with paved runways and well-built dispersal areas. Tinian was a very necessary island for us to take. It was taken in 9 days in a smooth and beautifully coordinated operation from veteran Japanese troops who were well-equipped and smartly led.
Was it as tough as Saipan, John?
Well, they really shouldn't be compared. At Saipan, due to the rugged terrain, the fighting was very mean. But on the other hand, at Saipan, the landings were made over thousands of yards of beach. While at Tinian, all our forces were funneled through a very narrow beachhead, narrower even than Tarawa. I believe it was the narrowest beach area ever used by our invading forces.
How do you account for the success under those circumstances?
Because through the masterful tactics and organization of forces by Rear Admiral Harry W. Hill in command, the 4th and 2nd Marines achieved almost complete surprise. The Japs were expecting us at the wide beaches in front of Tinian town, at the other end of the island, where they had concentrated their main defenses. This northern landing was, to me, a masterstroke because it saved many American lives. Another advantage of the northern landing was that it allowed us to mass our artillery on Saipan across the 2.5-mile channel to give heavy shell fire screen for the assault troops.
Could you see them over there on Saipan?
We certainly could. The artillery was lined up over there, almost hub to hub, for the better part of a mile. We watched the flashes run up and down the shore like strings of giant firecrackers. At the same time, a ring of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers blasted important targets all over the island, and thunderbolts and Mitchell bombers were shuttling back and forth from Saipan in a steady stream. Some of the planes took off, accomplished their missions, and were back at Isley Field loading up again in about a quarter of an hour.
What was the nature of the Jap resistance?
Their first show of real resistance was at dawn of D-Day +1, when about 2,000 Japs put on one of their suicidal banzai attacks. The Marines had so quickly consolidated their lines that the Japs were cut to pieces in short order. Very nearly all of the 2,000 were killed. From then on, with our many tanks operating in wonderful tank country, the Marines simply overran all resistance until the Japs made their final stand on the high ground at the south end. There was some pretty rough fighting toward the end. In this amphibious warfare in the Pacific, taking an island like Tinian may be compared in importance to the taking of one of the great fortress cities in the European conflict.
You've heard John Bishop, war correspondent for the Saturday Evening Post, just back from the battlefront in the Marianas. And thank you, John. This is Webley Edwards at Pearl Harbor. I return you now to Admiral in New York.
There is another item from the Pacific today. From Tokyo comes this grim piece of news. All Japanese civilians are soon to be armed to fight in defense of their homeland. The enemy's decision to wage a total war was contained in a cabinet agreement, and the decree seems to reflect Japan's fear of an imminent invasion of her home islands. Fears were not lessened by a subsequent American announcement that Lieutenant General Robert Richardson's Army Command of the Pacific Ocean areas has been extended westward to the Japanese mainland and beyond. And now for a glance at the top developments here at home and an interview with American flyer who has taken part in operations from Italian bases. Admiral takes you to CBS Washington. Don Pryor reporting.
Philadelphia's strike-bound transportation system has begun operations again for the first time since last Tuesday, although it's still not on a full normal schedule. The Army has ordered all the men back to work by midnight tonight. Here in Washington, the Senate will begin debate Tuesday on unemployment compensation measures, a part of the reconversion schedule. One bill, introduced by Senators Truman, Murphy, and Kilgore, provides for payments up to $35 a week. Another, which has the approval of the Finance Committee, headed by Senator George, proposes to leave the whole matter up to the various states with federal aid. A hot fight is expected over that issue. Military officials here are alarmed about the recent lag in war production and are fighting a WPD order to authorize partial civilian production beginning August 15th. Probably the most important air power development since the war began is a long-range fighter plane, the Mustangs, Lightnings, and Thunderbolts that have been escorting big bombers everywhere in Europe. Here's a man who's been flying those long missions, Lieutenant Colonel Alvin C. Gillen, 2nd of Columbus, Georgia. What were you flying, Colonel?
A Mustang, the P-51.
Well, what was the longest flight you ever made?
Well, I've been over the oil fields of Ploesti, Romania 4 times, and I've been to Vienna, Austria, Toulon, France, and Bucharest, Romania.
Oh, where was your base?
At Foggia in southeastern Italy. We moved down there after the beachhead was established at Anzio. We had to cover that first.
Oh, yes. I want to ask some questions about that a little later. But first, how about these long flights? What impressed you most?
And by the time we got back from each flight, the thing that had impressed me the most was the seat. We were off in the air for 6 hours at a time. Otherwise, I guess the most impressive thing was the German flak. Around places like Ploesti and Vienna, it was so thick you could walk on it.
Well, Colonel, just how can you stretch the range of a little fighter like the P-51 so that it will cover so much territory?
Well, we use belly tanks for extra gas and drop them as soon as they're empty.
And you still have enough left for a fight if necessary, huh?
Oh, sure. And incidentally, the P-51 is one of the sweetest fighters in the air and one of the toughest. One time over Toulon, I got a burst of flak in my motor. All the way home, I thought it would conk out any minute, but it never did.
Well, Colonel, on an average long-range mission, about how many fighters would you have?
Well, I could hardly tell you that, but I can say that we're flying P-51s. We always felt that we could take on just about any force that Jerry's cared to send up. We had 15 or 20.
Well, did you run into very much fighter opposition?
It was spotty, sometimes very light and sometimes plenty thick. Before we left the base, each of us would put a couple of dollars in a pot to be given to the highest-scoring team when we got back.
Well, we mentioned the Anzio beachhead a while ago. I suppose that was the most exciting job you've ever had, wasn't it?
In some ways. Mostly it was hard work.
Well, Colonel Gillum was in command of the only planes that operated from the beachhead when it was the most heavily bombarded spot in the world. What was your assignment?
We had to be ready all the time to intercept any German planes that came over. We flew right off the beaches within artillery range of the Germans.
Well, that must have been a nice, restful experience.
Well, we didn't get much sleep, but then neither did anyone else. I'm grateful for the experience, though, because it opened my eyes to the hardships the infantry has to put up with and fight through. We usually have it pretty easy at our bases, and we seldom get a chance to see foot soldiers in their foxholes, always wet and dirty and always under fire. Gave us all the respect in the world for the plain GI.
Did you get very much action at Anzio?
Plenty, usually about 3 combat missions a day. We were flying British Spitfires in. The Germans were sending over the best they had. It was our job to keep them away from the beaches where our ships were unloading constantly. It was lively enough, all right. I flew practically 2/3 of my 90 missions while I was there.
And now, after 13 months abroad, I suppose it's pretty good to get back with your wife and daughter for a while.
Wonderful.
Well, I return you now to Admiral in New York.
In Montana, Major General Louis B. Hershey, the National Selective Service Director, has expressed the belief that all eligible high school boys in the nation will eventually be in the armed services, regardless of whether or not the war with Germany is ended. General Hershey told a news conference, "I can't speak for the Navy or War Department, but in my opinion, the high school youth of America who are militarily acceptable will see service in the armed forces after the war in Europe is cleaned up. There are a lot of doughboys and other American soldiers who've been in this thing for 4 years. I think, said Hershey, they'll be waiting to come back home. The general said there is little prospect of a rapid demobilization. It took 30 months at 1,000 men an hour to go from a little over 1 million men to a striking force of 11 million. Demobilization will be slow." And now, once again, here is Warren Sweeney with a word from Admiral.
During the 7 years before Pearl Harbor, Admiral Corporation advanced from 52nd to 4th place in the production of radios for the home. That's a typically American success story with a surprisingly simple formula. Admiral has always given the buying public just what it wanted. When people complained about unsightly aerial and ground wires, Admiral designed a built-in aeroscope. When more convenient tuning was desired, Admiral originated tilt tuning with a soft glow dial, easy to read standing or sitting. When radio phonographs gained popularity, Admiral gave America a dependable, trouble-free, inexpensive automatic record changer. Again, the response was so great that Admiral soon became the world's largest manufacturer of radio phonographs with automatic record changers. In supporting America's war effort, Admiral has led in research on radio, radar, communications equipment, and television. So, when America's enemies have surrendered, Admiral will give you just what you'll be wanting in your next radio or television receiver. You can always expect the best of everything from Admiral. The 5th war loan is drawn to a successful close, but the need for all of us to buy war bonds, more and more of them, has not ended. Our boys in Italy, Normandy, and the Pacific need your help today just as badly as they did last week or last month. Remember, too, the road to post-war financial security for you is paved with war bonds. So, if for no other reason than its personal advantage to you and your family, buy all the war bonds you possibly can. World News Today is brought to you each Sunday at this hour by Admiral Corporation, makers of Admiral Radio, America's Smart Set, and post-war makers of Admiral Refrigerators, Admiral Home Freezers, Admiral Electric Ranges. Be sure to listen again next Sunday when Admiral brings you World News Today by shortwave, direct from leading news centers of the world. This is CBS, the Columbia Broadcasting System.
WBBM, Chicago.
World News Today, brought to you by Admiral Corporation in behalf of distributors and dealers all over America and in many foreign lands. By shortwave broadcast direct from important overseas stations and leading news centers of our own country, CBS reporters are waiting to bring you first-hand news from the world's political and battlefronts. Now, here's Douglas Edwards.
Supreme Allied Headquarters reports that the Americans have begun a general advance on a 30-mile front in France today with terrific support from the Air Command. There was also another heavy bombing of the southern French coast, the kind that in the past has preceded landing operations. On the eastern front, Berlin acknowledges that German troops are withdrawing at certain points from the Carpathians to the Baltic, and there are indications the Russians are about to step up the speed of their offensive once again. In Italy, the city of Empoli, west of Florence, has fallen to the Eighth Army without a fight. The Allies are rushing food and medical supplies to Florence, civilians, despite continual enemy sniping. In the Far East, Chongqing says heavy fighting is going on in the Hunan province in the southern suburbs of the rail city of Hengyang, where the Japs are trying to dislodge stubborn Chinese defenders. And now for news sent direct from overseas, Admiral takes you to London, Richard C. Hotelet reporting.
The Germans are trying to pull their forces out of the Allied trap in western France today. Since yesterday afternoon, German infantry, armor, motor, transport, and horse-drawn equipment have been crowding the few remaining roads that lead out through the Falaise Gap. Something like 100,000 men and several hundred tanks are trying to get out. And all this time, during every hour of daylight, these choked roads have been bombed, machine-gunned, and hit by the rockets of all the medium and fighter bombers we could put into the air. Correspondents at the front have described the bombs cascading down from planes glistening in the sun. And the Germans' only protection has been the dust of their escape. The Germans indicate today that they not only have their 7th Army in this threatened area, but also their 5th. We don't know much about this 5th Army, except that it was raised in the West at the beginning of the war and then disbanded. Meanwhile, the gap through which the Germans are trying to escape is being narrowed down. The American column pushing north from Alençon is still operating behind a security curtain, but the Germans have made several admissions that reveal its progress. For one thing, the enemy says that it's pushed on several miles beyond Alençon toward Falaise. And another enemy reports Alençon is a base for strong concentrations not only of American armor and motorized equipment, but also of our infantry. There are now only about 30 miles of escape gap left for the Germans, and with this American strength in the area, we can be sure that it's in the process of being narrowed down right now. Up on the northern jaw of the trap, the Germans have been fighting desperately to prevent the British and Canadians from advancing on Falaise. So far, they've been successful, but they haven't been able to prevent our allies from cleaning out a German salient between the Orne and Lys rivers. Here, British and Canadian and Polish forces now combined, and with German pockets cleared up, are putting on increasing pressure today. Although things are bad for the Germans, there's no sign yet that their withdrawal is a rout. Correspondents say that massed artillery and some tank formations are fighting determined rearguard actions, and that supplies for these troops continue to go in as the retreating columns seek a way out. Everywhere, the Germans seem to be fighting courageously. At the bottom of the bag, between Ville and Mortain, we have advanced on a wide front, taking the town of Saudeval. This is as much German withdrawal, though, as it is our advance. The Germans are racing against disaster. A message from von Kluge's headquarters says that the decisive battle of the entire invasion campaign may take place in the near future. And this seems to be true no matter what happens between Vire and Falaise. Our command is not losing sight of the possibility that the Germans may rescue some of their forces from the Allied trap. But rescue is hardly the right word, because they'll then be caught this side of the Seine. Already, General Eisenhower is taking steps to make sure that the German 5th and 7th Armies are caught and crushed in western France. He's trying to make the line of the Seine impassable both to the retreating Germans and to any reserves they have on the other side. Today, more than 1,250 heavy bombers blasted highways and railroads on both sides of the Seine from Paris down to its estuary. It certainly looks as if the Allied pincer movement is double-barreled. The Germans yesterday held a show of strength in Paris. What's described as a great many troops and full-field equipment paraded through the streets. The purpose, as the Germans explain it, was to show the Parisians who was still in charge. Apparently, the Parisians have been getting more and more exuberant with the approach of the Allies, and florists have been doing big business selling flowers to be thrown at our troops as they march into the capital. I return you now to Admiral in New York.
More news in just a moment, but first here's Warren Sweeney with a message from Admiral Corporation.
Radio has done more to stimulate the appreciation of good music than any other medium. Admiral Corporation is proud of the part it has played in America's musical life. The needs of war now occupy Admiral's full efforts in producing vital radar and electronic equipment. When peace returns, however, you can have a new Admiral radio in your home. Some of these fine new models of Admiral radios and radio phonographs will provide the matchless reception possible only with FM. When the practicability of television has been proved, Admiral television sets will open the door to an entirely new world of enjoyment. Post-war, your choice may be made from a wide range of sizes and styles, from the Admiral Bantam or personal type receiver to the superb models of combinations made in the great modern factories of Admiral Corporation, world's largest manufacturer of radio phonographs with automatic record changers. Now, here once again is Douglas Edwards.
Europe's eastern front is showing signs of breaking into movement today, which may quickly sweep the Russians into Warsaw and East Prussia. A German military commentator has admitted that Russian attacks against the Hungarians were only partly repelled as the Soviets renewed their pressure toward Slovakia and Hungary. And east and north of Warsaw, a Russian tank attack forced a German retreat of several miles. The Germans also admitted fresh Russian gains northwest of Bialystok. And now for a summary of the military situation in that part of the world, here is Columbia's military analyst, Major George Fielding Elliott.
Activities on the Russian front continue to center along the frontiers of East Prussia and in the area southwest of Sandomierz, where the Russians are trying to widen and deepen their bridgehead over the upper Vistula River. Let's take a quick look at this front from north to south. In the extreme north, we find the Russians widening the corridor which cuts off the German army group of General Lindemann in Estonia and Latvia. Early last week, Lindemann made one rather feeble attempt to break out, which failed. On the western flank of this corridor, the Russians are now pushing toward the Baltic coast, evidently with the purpose of taking Libau and Memel and then swinging southward to attack the northern frontier of East Prussia along the river Niemen. On the eastern approaches to East Prussia, very strong German counterattacks have checked the Russian advance opposite the Insterberg Gap between the river Niemen and the Masurian Lakes. Round to the southwest, the Russians from the direction of Bialystok are making slow but on the whole steady gains in the direction of the fortress of Ossowiec, which guards the East Prussian frontier in this sector. East of Warsaw, the Russians are working their way northwestward from the general area of the town of Schadelsee and are approaching the strong German positions along the Narew River. They do not appear to have reached the river anywhere on this part of the front. The fight of the Polish underground forces in Warsaw is still going on, but no help appears to be reaching them, and it is doubtful whether they can be given effective support unless the Russians can break down the eastern defenses of the Polish capital within the next few days. Farther south along the Vistula, there is no very great activity until the area of Sandomierz is reached. Southwest of that town, the Russians are making their greatest threat at the moment. They have a deep bridgehead on the western side of the Vistula, and they are extending it toward the road junction city of Kielce and toward the old Polish capital of Krakow. The latter is probably the direction in which the Russians are chiefly interested, as the road to Krakow is also the road to the great industrial district of Silesia, now one of the major pillars of the German war effort. It is therefore not surprising to learn from yesterday's Russian communique that heavy counterattacks by German tanks and infantry are taking place against this Russian bridgehead. Still farther south, along the Carpathian foothills, the Russians have made local advances. The Germans appear to be trying to create the impression that the Russians in this area are intending to force their way across the mountain passes into Slovakia and Hungary. No doubt the Germans think this is good propaganda to make the Slovaks and Hungarians fight harder on the German side, but it seems to be scaring both the Slovaks and the Hungarians out of their senses, or perhaps back into some approach to common sense. as there have been persistent reports all week of separate peace moves and political shakeups in both countries. The Russians have not officially indicated any mountain crossing intentions so far in this Carpathian area. Now here again is Douglas Edwards.
Major George Fielding Elliott has just given you an analysis of the military situation on the Eastern Front. German armies in Italy, their morale bolstered by a proclamation by Adolf Hitler himself telling them that the Nazis will be ready to assume the offensive in 6 weeks, sent many patrols probing into the Allied lines south of the Arno River today. And American heavy bombers from the Mediterranean again attacked the southern French coast. For details and other news from the Italian front, Admiral takes you to CBS Rome, Winston Burdett reporting.
Our air attacks against the French and Italian Rivieras continue. Against gun positions from Genoa to Marseille. Against railway yards and airfields further inland. Liberators today struck at rail bridges across the lower Rhone River, while other heavy bombers went out in force to raid coastal targets. Here in Rome, there has been no official hint as to the purpose of Prime Minister Churchill's visit to Italy. But the Italian papers are full of speculation and comment. Many of them take this occasion to lay the grievances of occupied Italy before the Prime Minister. 2 papers address open appeals to Mr. Churchill. One of them suggests that Mr. Churchill take a motor trip from Rome to Naples to see, it says, whether we, the Italians, have suffered enough, and to decide whether we are still to be considered a conquered people. The Party of Action paper, in an open letter to Mr. Churchill, says, I quote, we should be lying both to ourselves and to you, our allies, if we said that all has gone well on the way to reconstruction of the country. We are still technically considered enemies of the United Nations, our liberators. The Socialist paper today says that relations between the Allies and Italy are getting more and more strained. There are many signs, the paper says, that the policy of the Versailles Treaty is being applied in Italy today. In denouncing these signs, which may have fatal results, we socialists feel that we are doing our duty as Italians, as Democrats, as Europeans. As you see, political comment in the papers here is very candid, often very bitter. Nearly every day we read statements just as strong as these. The anti-fascist Italians who are thinking seriously about Italy's future are profoundly discouraged by our policy. Their leaders have a genuine desire to restore democracy in Italy. But after 20 years of fascism, they sometimes lack confidence in their ability to do the job. But this is not the only reason for their sense of frustration. The present Italian government has no real power. It must turn to the Allies for approval of every slightest thing it wants to do. It must get our permission to name a new prefect or department head or any senior civil or military officer. On the central issue of the monarchy versus the republic, we have asked the Italian government to wait until after the war. But events do not wait. Blocks form and forces begin to roll, and already Republican parties on the one hand and royalist groups on the other are beginning to close ranks and prepare for what seems today must be an inevitable conflict. This is Winston Burdett in Rome, returning you now to CBS in New York.
For a summary of the situation in the Pacific and an interview with a Marine from Hoboken, New Jersey, who had quite an experience on Guam, Admiral takes you to CBS Pearl Harbor. Webley Edwards reporting.
Here's a Marine corporal who found himself in a tight spot after killing several Japs on Guam, played dead for 6 hours. He's here with me now, his arm and shoulder harnessed up, but otherwise looking like the pride of Hoboken, New Jersey, his home city. Marine Corporal Fred Hoffman, Jr. Corporal, the story starts when you were sent out on a forward post during the advance at Guam. Is that right?
That's right. They told us to dig in the best we could, and in case the Nips tried to come through, we were supposed to stop them. The 4 of us scooped out a shore home, found some lumber and corrugated iron from the roof, and then we crawled in and got set for the night. I had the second watch. It must have been an hour later when I looked up and saw Nip staring me right in the face. Having a .45 in my hand, I stuck it out right at him. Muzzle must have been only a foot from his face. He just kept staring at the pistol and at me.
How do you figure he didn't do anything to stare at you?
Crazy, I guess. Anyway, I let 5 shots go right in his kisser and he dropped. Then I turned around and yelled to the guys, but everybody was already awake. No sooner had I turned back around than there was another Nip right alongside the first one. I shot him with a carbine. Then I heard a little commotion out in front. We looked out and saw about 15 Nips, maybe more, there in the moonlight. We didn't shoot because they'd see our fire, and anyway, we figured to wait for them to come up and we could pick them off one at a time.
They started coming at you?
Everything was quiet for a while, and then they tossed a grenade and it hit the front protection and didn't do any damage. Nicky calls me at the section, either handed me a grenade and says, heave it out. I heaved it, and we heard a lot of moans, so I must have got quite a few of them. Then they threw another one at us, but it hit outside again. Then they all came charging at a hole, yelling like hell. They came right up and then kept running around like a bunch of kids, yelling all the time. Then one of them rolled a grenade in, and Mickey hollered, "Grenade in the hole."
What'd you do then?
I rolled quick on my side to protect my face and went off onto my right shoulder. Tripped me up, and then I felt the blood oozing out.
Did it surprise you that you could take a grenade without being killed?
Oh, I thought it was gone. I whispered down to Mickey, and I said, I think I'll be gone in about 5 minutes. Mickey said, stay in there, Fred. Then I thought that if I lay in such a way to keep from losing blood, I might live, so I didn't move. The Nips threw another grenade, and this one took off the corrugated iron roof. Then they came up and jumped up and down on the 2x4s and yelled, but they didn't come in. They must have thought we were all 4 dead. Anyway, I had the idea of playing dead, and when one Nip reached down and jabbed me with the butt of his rifle, I stood with my eyes open and didn't move. He jabbed the bayonet into the legs of the runner, Ziak, and I think he was stunned from the grenade. Anyway, he didn't move either. Then the Nips took off.
Did he take off for good?
Not all of them. They tossed another grenade, but it landed outside, and 2 of them stayed. We could hear them talking, so we kept on playing dead. We could signal back and forth by squeezing. About 4:30, the Japs started retreating back through. When they glanced in, I kept staring, and they passed on by.
You didn't dare use the phone, I guess.
Right. We figured they'd hear us talking, and also it would be suicide for anybody to come up for us right then. About 5:30, we decided the Japs had retreated, and we phoned. In half an hour, medical corpsmen and stretcher boys were up with plasma in a jeep.
Were you glad to see them?
Are you kidding? We near burst out crying. We were so glad.
Well, Fred, your folks and your girl back there in Hoboken, New Jersey, will be glad to know that you're in fine condition. You've heard the story of Marine Corporal Fred Hoffman, Jr., wounded at Guam. This is Webley Edwards at Pearl Harbor. I return you to Admiral in New York.
For Homefront News and an interview with the skipper of a Navy Night Patrol Bomber Squadron, Admiral takes you now to CBS Washington. Don Pryor reporting.
The War Production Board's 4th reconversion order is expected to be issued tomorrow, permitting limited and very limited production of civilian goods. Plans for the Russian, British, American Conference on a World Peace Organization are almost complete. The British delegation arrived here last night. The conference will open next Monday. On Capitol Hill, the House is expected to pass legislation this week to govern the disposal of surplus war property. And next week it will take up the controversial George Bill for demobilization and unemployment compensation. Just as a reminder that there's still a war in the South and Southwest Pacific, here is Lieutenant Commander Eugene P. Rankin, USN, of Sapulpa, Oklahoma, the skipper of Rankin's Raiders, a famous Black Cat squadron of Navy patrol bombers. He and his men have just come back after 7 months of hard flying with one of the finest records in the Navy. Commander Rankin, how many hours of flying did you say your squadron did out there?
About 7,500, and 4,500 of those were at night. Of course, flying at night is the principal job of the Black Cat.
And just what is a Black Cat?
It's a Catalina flying boat painted jet black. The Black Cat was originated at Guadalcanal to fly night search missions looking for the Tokyo Express, to keep the Japs on Munda and other islands awake by dropping bombs, empty beer bottles, pieces of junk, and anything else that was handy. My squadron was the 3rd Black Cat outfit to go out. By that time, the job had changed quite a lot.
Well, how do you mean it had changed?
By that time, the Tokyo Express had been pretty badly mauled. So our principal job was to find Jap barges and knock them out along the coast of Bougainville, and finally all the way up through New Ireland and Caribbean.
We also spotted for bombardments, flew cover for convoys and task forces, and in general kept the Japs stirred up as much as possible.
Was all of your combat flying at night?
Oh, no. During the last 2 months of 1943, we flew mostly search missions both day and night. Our real Black Cat operation started in January when we perfected a system of teamwork with the PT boats and destroyers.
Well, how did that work?
Well, I'll give you an example. One dark night, Lieutenant S.L. Lanier of Bessemer, Alabama, ran into 4 Jap barges and a gunboat off the coast of Bougainville. He called the PTs, which were patrolling off the shore, and they answered, "Roger, be right over there in about 2 minutes." Meanwhile, the Black Cat strafed the barges, trying to slow them down. When the PTs got there, they joined in the fight. But the Black Cat's port engine was shot out by the gunboat, and 2 of the PTs were pretty badly damaged. Between them, they sank 3 of the barges, and they couldn't finish the job. Lanier had to fly 75 miles back home on 1 engine, but meanwhile, he called in the destroyers, and the next day they polished off the gunboat.
That's real teamwork. Commander, is that kind of thing still going on in the Solomons?
Oh, yes. There are still 30 or 35,000 Japs around there, you know. Of course, they're getting a little punch-drunk by now, I guess. Toward the end, we were flying all the way up to New Britain, New Ireland, and Caribbean. We covered the landings at Emerald.
With Catalinas?
Yes, all the way from Emerald. That's a long way. We kept that up for 5 weeks, covering the task forces, the landings, and the convoys. We would take off at 3 in the afternoon and get back at noon the next day.
And Commander Rankin says that the only stops they made on that trip was one at Green Island to refuel. For all that, and despite 100 other close shaves and adventures that we haven't time now to tell, Lieutenant Commander Rankin and his Rankin's Raiders never lost a single plane or a single man in 7 months of flying. That's a record to be proud of. I return you to Admiral in New York.
From Portland, Oregon, comes word that after escaping capture on Jap-held Guam for 31 months, Chief Radio Man George Ray Tweed was nearly killed by a Jap sniper on Saipan after his rescue by an American battleship. Tweed and a Marine captain were riding along a dusty road when machine gun bullets whizzed past Tweed's ear, so close that he had to feel to make sure it was still there. They scampered to cover by the roadside, where 2 embarrassed Marines were very happy to see them. Marines asked, "Would you mind sticking around for a while and maybe taking a crack at the bushes where the sniper is?" Tweed, a crack shot, was delighted. He hates Japs with a vehemence startling when one knows his natural modesty and quiet good humor. He said, "I got a good bead on the bushes and was just waiting for a movement when some men who had circled around behind him blew his head off. Then he was a good Jap." Tweed says if the Navy assigns him back to sea duty, he'll ask for the Central Pacific again. One more item. In China, fighting in Hunan province has raged with undiminished fury today, with the Japanese in possession of the vital rail city of Hanyang. Heavy fighting is reported in and around the perimeter of province towns on the north and south of the city, where the Chinese hope to forestall Japanese conquest of the Canton to Hankow Railway. And now, once again, here is Warren Sweeney with a word from Admiral.
We've been talking for some months about the Admiral 2-temperature refrigerator to be presented to America after victory has been won. But the other day, someone asked, "What do you mean, a 2-temperature refrigerator?" Well, we thought it was self-explanatory. 2-temperature means simply that there will be 2 completely different temperatures in the 2 separate compartments of the Admiral refrigerator, a temperate, moist cold in the spacious, regular compartment, and a dry, Arctic cold in the home freezer compartment. The first compartment, with its purified, moist cold, is for the storage of foods that require above-freezing temperatures. This compartment will have no space-stealing, frost-collecting coils to rob the moisture from foods, and it will need no defrosting ever. And foods will stay fresh and appetizing without covered dishes. The second compartment is a built-in home freezer for quick freezing your own foods or for storing commercially frozen products. This is what we mean when we say the Admiral 2-temperature refrigerator is the first major advancement in home refrigeration in many years. And behind it is all the know-how, all the prestige, and the precision production methods of the makers of Admiral Radio, America's smart set. If America is to prepare enough nurses to maintain essential civilian nursing services and meet the future needs of the armed forces, the U.S. Public Health Service must enroll 60,000 cadet nurses this year. You may write to U.S. Cadet Nurse Corps, Box 88, New York City, for full information. Answer your country's call. Be a cadet nurse. World News Today is brought to you each Sunday at this hour by Admiral Corporation, makers of Admiral Radio, America's Smart Set, and post-war makers of Admiral refrigerators, Admiral home freezers, Admiral electric ranges. Be sure to listen again next Sunday when Admiral brings you World News Today by shortwave, direct from leading news centers of the world. This is CBS, the Columbia Broadcasting System.
WBBM. Dr. Benjamin Ordway is the kindly but shrewd crime doctor. His methods of tracking down a criminal are almost uncanny.